that because I've remembered that I went to Austria and I was giving a lecture to the postgraduate students. It was a lecture on the forest roads in the Carpathians. My Ukrainian colleagues complained and criticized me for having shown some bad photographs of the Carpathians. But believe me, those photographs were much better than what we can see right now on the screen. Yeah, Volodymyr was not really sure whether you can understand, but Natalia is saying that we have simultaneous interpretation, so you can hear everything in English. Volodymyr, recently we made some presentations and there were some bad photographs, at least in the opinion of certain people. But I mean, you need to demonstrate the real state of play, and it's only normal that you utilize different photographs, even bad ones, because you want to illustrate the current state of affairs. Well, the truth is always useful. It doesn't really matter what the truth is. Hello, Volodymyr. This is Yuri speaking. I looked through the presentation. So this is a real place, a real location. This is basically a finding of a real inventory. So basically, we have what we have. I mean, this is the way it is. Why embellish it or why sugarcoat it? You will see it a little bit later in the presentation. Exactly, you will see it because I borrowed it from the presentation. I'm fine with that. My point is that for whatever reason, we have this idealistic approach, not only to forest roads, but to forestry in general. And whenever I make presentations, I try to demonstrate the reality because I mean, it's all about improvement, right? We want to become better in the end. And usually I say that any human activity has an impact on environment. And we need to make baby steps, but we need to be consistent in that to approach the ideal that we are aspiring to. But this is something that will not really happen overnight, and sometimes it's a costly effort. Colleagues, I suggest that we get started. I'm pretty much sure that people will continue joining. And that's why we decided to start with an introductory presentation, and people will have some more time to join. And the participants will not really miss the main presentation from our expert. So greetings, everyone, once again. Greetings at our fourth webinar. This is a webinar that is taking place within the program Best Management Practices of the U.S. Forest Service regarding water quality in Ukraine or for Ukraine. Just a reminder that our training is taking place with the support of the U.S. Forest Service. The Forest Service is within the Agriculture Department. The organizers of this training is Forza NGO and the U.S. Forest Service. And as you can understand, there's been a lot of strain on us as organizers. Our training program comprises 6 webinars. Today, we're going to have our 4th webinar. Our main lecturer will be Christopher Brown, and the topic of the training is sediment breakthroughs. So basically, we will talk about sediment breakthroughs associated with logging in the New York City watershed. On this slide, you can see some subsequent webinars. So we will be talking about low intensity roads, forest roads in the first place. And the lecturer will be Erika Borum. Several years ago, she visited Ukraine and she was a co-trainer within the training program on forest road construction. And the topic for our final webinar will be data and information dissemination. So the focus will be on digital technologies, tools utilized by the US, and this webinar will be conducted by John Carlson. The format of our webinars is as follows. So we will have a 30-minute presentation on the main theme. So basically that will be a presentation from our key expert. And during the presentation, we would like to encourage you to ask questions. You might have some points of clarification, especially if something is not clear. There might be a lot of new terms, novel concepts. Maybe some of the approaches that you will be exposed to will be new to you. So if something is not clear, please speak out and articulate your questions or comments. Then we will have a lengthy Q&A session. And the priority, of course, goes to questions and answers, but if we have some time left, then we will have a short quiz. Some ground rules. If you participated in our previous webinars, then you know all this. We are going to have simultaneous interpretation. If you want to access simultaneous interpretation, you need to find a globe symbol at the bottom of the Zoom screen and pick the relevant channel depending on the language that you want to hear. If you want to hear everything in Ukrainian, pick the Ukrainian channel. If you want to listen to everything in English, pick the English, or you can have simultaneous interpretation off. So basically you can listen to everything in the original language, be it English or Ukrainian. If you cannot access simultaneous interpretation for whatever reason, please write about it in the chat or just unmute yourself and voice it. If you have good internet, please have your cameras on. We do understand that in certain regions of Ukraine, connectivity is poor right now, but still, if possible, please have your cameras on. If you want to say something, unmute yourself. If you're not speaking, please mute yourself because we don't really want to have any background noise. If you have a question or a comment, either write about it in the chat or raise a hand physically or virtually. So do not be shy, do not hesitate. If something is not clear or you have a question, you either raise your hand or you unmute yourself and you voice your question. And settle down comfortably and snugly. We are going to record our webinar. Based on this series of webinars, we want to put together a short training course, and it will be public and open source. So basically, it will be available to anyone interested. I guess that's it on my part. So that was a short intro and a big request to have your cameras on at least for a couple of minutes because we want to have a screenshot. So I will stop screen sharing. Eduard, you had your camera on. Come on, please re-emerge on our screen. We want to see your face. Once again, a big request to everyone. If you can have your camera on, please do it because it will be pleasant later for you to see yourselves next to the faces of your colleagues, and then you will reminiscence about it. Like in 20 years, you will be reminiscent of this webinar, and then in 20 years, you will say something along the lines of, I was so young back then. So if possible, please have your cameras on, and we will have a group photograph. A smile, a big smile, have it plastered on your faces, and you can even say hi to each other. Yeah, you can wave, you can, I don't know, exhibit any other reactions. Or maybe you can use some of the reactions on Zoom. Thank you very much. Done? So we can continue. If it's comfortable for you to have your cameras on, we will be very grateful. If not, of course, you can have them off. I think that most of the participants have already joined. If someone is late, it's just okay. We can get started anyway. I mean, we have already started, but we can get down to the essence of our webinar. And it's a great delight of mine to give the floor to Chris Brown. He put together a presentation just for you. It's a presentation that is grounded on the study about the New York City watershed. Yeah, and we just need Leslie to mute herself. Now we are ready. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to speak with you today about a research project we completed in 2019 to evaluate the effectiveness of forestry BMPs to protect water quality on about 40 recently harvested properties in the New York City watershed. Over the last 23 years, the Watershed Agricultural Council has cost-shared forestry BMPs to protect water quality on 712 timber harvests in the New York City watershed. 163 of these harvests had one or more stream crossings on them where BMP implementation was critical. In total, WAC spent $2.9 million on BMPs that keep roads and trails out of stream buffers, BMPs that slow and disperse trail runoff, provide ground surface cover, and trap sediment on the landscape. And we always want to know how well our BMPs are working to protect water quality, which is why we do field studies to evaluate them. Previous studies of BMP implementation in the New York City watershed have identified water diversion devices for skid trails and stream crossings as problem areas. And as we've learned, those water diversion devices could be things like water bars, broad-based dips, rolling dips. And while these studies evaluated the extent to which harvesting practices followed the New York State Voluntary BMP Field Guide, few studies have addressed how well these BMPs work on the ground to keep sediment out of streams. Some studies of BMP effectiveness have focused on the pathways of sediment delivery to stream channels. BMP success or failure is based on whether or not evidence of surface runoff stops on the landscape or it reaches the stream. Surface runoff that connects an erosion source like a skid trail or a landing to the stream is called a sediment breakthrough. Next, I will show an example of a BMP success and failure. This is an example of a success, one in which you'll just have to take my word for it. In this case, surface runoff from a skid trail has flowed off of the trail and out onto a grass-covered floodplain. Runoff infiltrated and sediment was deposited on land prior to reaching the stream. And this is what we want. This is a success. Now in this photo, a scoured flow path cuts across a skid trail and continues on connecting with the stream channel below that we're trying to protect. Now, this is an example of a failure of BMPs to keep sediment out of the stream, and this is what we term a sediment breakthrough. This term sediment breakthrough actually comes from studies that had buffered stream channels, so a stream side management zone. And when a runoff flow path cuts through that stream buffer to reach the stream, that's where the term sediment breakthrough comes from. So what do we know about sediment breakthroughs in logging from the peer-reviewed literature? Previous studies looking at recent clear-cut harvests, so harvests that were less than 2 years old, in the Virginia Piedmont and in New Zealand, found that breakthrough spatial frequency averaged about 5 breakthroughs per kilometer of stream buffer surveyed. A similar harvest in the Georgia Piedmont region of the US found 1 breakthrough for every 8 hectares of timber harvested. Another study of U.S. Forest Service lands and harvests in the Cascade and Sierra Nevada mountain regions found only 6 sediment breakthroughs across 200 harvest units. However, these harvests were between 2 to 18 years old when field data was collected, and the stream buffers that were used were very wide. They were 90 meters wide for perennial streams, 45 meters wide for intermittent streams. Furthermore, the recent harvests in that U.S. Forest Service study were thinnings and group selection cuts. So across all of these studies, they've all done a great job of identifying common sources of sediment breakthroughs associated with timber harvesting, and they include stream crossings, places where surface runoff flows down or across roads and trails, old agricultural gullies that were reactivated through timber harvesting, and just in general, logging machines harvesting too close to the stream channel. So while these studies did a great job of quantifying how often breakthroughs occurred and identified their most common causes, prediction about where they will occur is still difficult. So these previous studies from the peer-reviewed literature helped us to shape our research questions about sediment breakthroughs and logging here in the New York City watershed. And they are as follows. How often do sediment breakthroughs occur? What are the most common sources? How bad are erosion rates at stream crossings? And this is important because when you have an erosion source so close to the stream channel, any sediment that will move has a relatively direct flow path to the stream. So we need to have BMPs in place at these highly sensitive areas. Furthermore, can we help to predict where breakthroughs will occur? And then how can we use these study findings to improve our forestry BMP program here at the Watershed Agricultural Council? We identified 136 logging jobs that had been harvested within the last 5 years, and harvests that also had at least some skid trail segments that were located within 46 meters of a variable width forest buffer around streams that were second order or greater. We wanted to focus our study on recent harvests because sites revegetate over time and become less erodible over time. However, we also wanted sites to be old enough that we could examine sediment breakthrough frequency over time. So we identified the landowners of these 136 properties, and we sent them a research proposal and a pre-stamped return postcard to indicate whether or not they were interested in participating in this study. We had a response rate of 40%, and 47 landowners agreed to participate. Ultimately, we surveyed 43 of those properties. Harvest sites were well distributed throughout the Catskill, Delaware, New York City watershed, which is pictured here. Most of the sites occurred in Delaware and Greene counties. The harvest sites were also well distributed in terms of time since harvest completion. 32 of the 43 harvests were between 1 to 3 years old when data was collected. We had 2 sites that were less than 1 year old and 9 sites that were between 4 to 5 years old at the time of the harvest. So this enables us to look at sediment breakthrough frequency over time. All of the harvests were representative of selective cutting, where a forester or a logger marks individual trees to be cut. In our area, chainsaw felling and cable skidding to a roadside landing by small 1 to 2 person crews is common. Relatively fewer loggers have mechanized equipment for harvesting and extraction, but they are out there. So how did we prepare for field work? We created maps for each property that showed important features like property boundaries, stream buffers, and the location of any landings, stream crossings, and skid trails used during the harvest. If I can direct your attention to the left image, that's showing the property boundary of a harvest in red. The skid trails that were used during the harvest are shown in black. We even have individual water bar locations used on the skid trails. And the maps also had flow lines from a flow accumulation layer that was made through GIS. And this layer shows overland flow potential. The flow lines were color-coded by drainage area, with the darkest blue lines indicating the largest drainage areas and therefore the greatest potential for surface runoff. Essentially, these flow lines show where small streams and places where runoff is likely to flow. It shows the location of those areas on the map for us. So we focused our surveys on places where the darkest blue flow lines, or the ones that had the greatest drainage area, crossed skid trails, because that's where we thought we would have the most chance of seeing evidence of surface runoff leaving the trail and connecting with the channel below that we were trying to protect. Our maps were uploaded to a smartphone mapping app called Avenza, which is, I took a screenshot and I've shown that on the right there. Avenza was used to mark the locations of breakthrough flow paths, including where they left the skid trail, where they intersected the stream buffer, which is shown in pink, and ultimately where those sediment breakthroughs reached the stream channel. So we had this smartphone mapping app with us at all times in the field, and we used that for field navigation as well as data collection. I thought it might be helpful to show you what these flow lines look like in the field now that you've seen what they look like on a map. In this case, we're looking at a very dark blue flow line, or a flow line that has a drainage area of 10 hectares or more. And in this example, it looks very much like a stream channel in its own right. It's pictured to the kind of left-hand side of the photograph here, flowing parallel to a skid trail. Then it crosses the trail where my field partner Stephanie is standing. And that flow line continued on to the stream we were trying to protect for a sediment breakthrough. Now we're looking at the dark blue flow line example, and these flow lines drain between 2.5 to 10 hectares. In this example, the flow line was captured by a roadside ditch, and the flow went underneath a culvert at a roadside landing. And this is what the sediment breakthrough looked like as it flowed through the forest down to the stream channel that we were trying to protect. So now we're looking at the medium blue flow line example. These flow lines drain between 0.2 and 2.5 hectares. In this example, the medium blue flow line on the map was a hillside seep on the ground, and the seep flow drained out onto the skid trail, it flowed down the trail to the nearest low spot. And because the skid trail was right next to the stream, the runoff just spilled over into the stream channel, and we marked this as a sediment breakthrough. And then lastly, the smallest flow lines that we looked at were the light blue flow lines that drain 0.4 to 0.2 hectares. And in this example, another skid trail that was close to the stream, I'm in the stream channel taking the picture, and flow just had a very short flow path to go through that logging slash and reach the channel. It was not a serious sediment breakthrough, but we could see evidence of surface runoff making its way to the channel. Next, I wanted to explain how a field survey typically progresses. And this map shows the same harvest property, and it's showing the skid trails of interest to us, highlighted in yellow. It's showing the purple boundary of the outer edge of the variable width buffer that we surveyed. So we entered the property at the roadside landing, which is shown as a green square. And we walked that primary skid trail looking for evidence of runoff coming off of the trail. And we came to a stream crossing, which is marked number 1. And we evaluated the BMPs that were implemented at that stream crossing. And then we continued across the stream and up the hill on the primary skid trail segment marked number 2. And along that skid trail segment, we looked for places where runoff flowed across the trail. At the end of segment 2, you can see some lines and dots. That is where we marked some runoff that went across the trail, but we determined that the runoff infiltrated. So we were marking stopped sediment breakthroughs as well. So this was an example of a BMP success. Once we finished with segment number 2, we walked back down the hill and we evaluated skid trail segment number 3. And you can see again at the end of that skid trail segment, there was another place where we found runoff to leave the trail, travel a short distance, and then infiltrate on the hill slope, another example of a BMP success. From segment 3, we walked back up the hill to the nearest skid trail, and we continued our survey for segments 4, 5, and 6. And I want to explain that we didn't evaluate every meter of skid trail on the timber harvest. We only looked at the skid trail that was closest to the stream. As you might be able to see, these flow lines cross the skid trails multiple times on their way down the hill. So we were most interested on kind of that last segment of trail where runoff could interact with the trail and reach the stream. So in this harvest, this was one where we didn't find any sediment breakthroughs at all, aside from the stream crossing that we evaluated. So this was a relatively good site. So what did we do when we found a sediment breakthrough? When a breakthrough was found, we marked the GPS location of the breakthrough source where runoff began to interact with the trail. We marked where runoff left the trail and where it reached the stream. And if I can direct your attention to the left-hand side of this photograph, the light blue pillowy looking thing is a stream buffer. And in this case, we've marked 3 different sediment breakthroughs coming off of the skid trail, flowing down through the forest, piercing through the outer edge of the buffer, and then reaching the stream. And we took measurements along a transect from the stream center to the outer edge of the buffer. and we tried to characterize how good of a sediment trap this forest buffer could be. So we measured the width of the breakthrough where it met the stream. We measured the terrain slope with a clinometer. We measured the bare soil percentage of the ground. We estimated ground surface roughness, the density of understory vegetation, and canopy cover. Along this transect from the center of stream to the outer edge of the buffer, we picked a central location on that transect, and we identified all tree species, and we measured basal area with a 10-factor prism. All of these measurements really just to demonstrate, how good was this forest buffer at trapping sediment. So when we came to a stream crossing on the second order stream or greater that we were trying to protect, we used the universal soil loss equation modified for forest land to estimate potential erosion on the trail approaches to that crossing. The universal soil loss equation brings together all of the factors that govern potential erosion, including rainfall characteristics and soil erodibility. Field measurements included things like approach length, slope, width, surface cover on the approaches, surface roughness, canopy height, and canopy cover. And the approach length was really defined as the nearest water bar on the trail that could direct runoff off of the skid trail, or kind of the nearest topographical feature that would move water off of the trail. So we're at the results part of this presentation, and in total we surveyed nearly 36 kilometers of stream buffer associated with 43 recently harvested sites, and we found 170 sediment breakthroughs. That's roughly 5 breakthroughs per kilometer of buffer surveyed, although breakthroughs didn't occur at regular intervals along the stream buffer. So these results do coincide with some previous studies from Virginia and in New Zealand. We did have a lot of variability from site to site in terms of breakthrough spatial frequency. The number of breakthroughs per kilometer of buffer surveyed ranged from 0 to 35 across all sites. 12 of the sites that we surveyed had no breakthroughs at all, which is great. And 70% of the sites had a breakthrough spatial frequency of 6 breakthroughs per kilometer or less. Initially, when we set out to do this study, we thought we would find more sediment breakthroughs for harvests that were cut, within 6 months to a year. But in the end, there was a poor relationship between breakthrough spatial frequency and the time since the harvest was completed. And that can be shown here in this scatter plot. We also thought that we would find a relationship between the length of skid trail that was built within the stream buffer and the number of sediment breakthroughs. And we didn't have a good relationship with that either. So these findings are demonstrating that something else was controlling or doing a better job of explaining how often we would find sediment breakthroughs. And I will come back to this in just a few slides. For now, I wanted to characterize the most common sources of breakthroughs for our study. We found that 30% of the breakthroughs were associated with stream crossing approaches, or places where the trails crossed the primary streams that we were trying to protect. This is good news from a management standpoint, as it's relatively easy to identify these road stream crossings and prescribe BMPs for stream crossing closure that cover exposed soil on the approaches and reduce the volume and velocity of surface runoff flowing directly to the stream. The other 70% of sediment breakthroughs, called non-crossing breakthroughs, these happened away from stream crossings at places where surface runoff flowed from the hill slope either down or directly across the trail, and they continued on to the buffered stream as overland flow. So these ones are more difficult to predict, namely because there are so many of these flow lines on the map. So now I'll talk a bit about the potential erosion rates at the stream crossings that we evaluated. Erosion rates range from 0 to 0.4 tons of sediment per year. The average was 0.02 tons per year. And 80% of these stream crossing approaches had erosion rates of 0.01 tons per year or less. On a per hectare basis, this is about 2.2 tons per hectare per year, which is a relatively low amount. And this suggests that most of the stream crossings were being closed out in a way that protects water quality over the long term. Not surprisingly, we found that potential erosion decreased over time. So we had the highest erosion rates for sites that were recently harvested. And this just underscores the importance of having BMPs in place during the harvest as well as during closeout. And we know this from the literature in that, over time sites revegetate, any exposed soil becomes washed away and is less erodible over time. I thought it could be informative to demonstrate in the photos, good versus poor BMPs and how that impacts potential erosion. This is a stream crossing approach that is relatively steep. Runoff can flow a long distance down the trail unregulated, and there's relatively poor surface cover aside from a lot of rock material. So when you combine a steep slope with poor surface cover and runoff that's able to run a long way, this results in a high erosion rate. Here is another example of a stream crossing approach that is steep and not necessarily ideal. However, through the use of forestry best management practices, the loggers installed 3 water bars. They used grass seed and straw mulch at closeout to provide surface cover, and this resulted in a very low minimal erosion rate. And I'm not saying that this wouldn't have had an impact on water quality during the timber harvest. I'm sure that it did. It's a very steep approach. However, this shows how BMPs can help to remediate a less than ideal stream crossing approach. So I wanted to talk for a moment about the forest buffers through which these sediment breakthroughs traveled. The breakthroughs traveled long distances through well-covered forested stream buffers. The median travel distance through these stream buffers was 24 meters, ranging from 3 to 124 meters. Total travel distance from the edge of the trail to the stream ranged from 3 to nearly 500 meters, with a median distance of 51 meters. Within the buffers, bare soil on the ground was minimal. Canopy cover and surface roughness were near maximum values. So they were as good as we could really expect in terms of being a sediment trap. So I think this finding means that we can't expect stream buffers to eliminate the connectivity between trails and streams. However, we can use BMPs on the roads and trails above the buffered streams to reduce runoff volume and reduce surface erosion. So, not counting the stream crossings, we found that 85% of the sediment breakthroughs that we found were associated with a nearby flow line trail crossing on our smartphone maps. So this supported our assertion that the flow accumulation flow lines were a good indicator about where to look for breakthroughs. These flow lines are a useful tool for our watershed foresters to predict potential problem areas for water quality protection. This screenshot is from my smartphone from some field data collection, and it's demonstrating 3 flow lines that are crossing over a skid trail on the map. And the green pins are just where we marked where the actual evidence of runoff left the trail, where it went through the outer edge of the buffer and where it reached the stream. So in this case, these 3 flow line trail crossings on the map were actually 3 sediment breakthroughs when we surveyed them on the ground. The problem is, though, that there are a lot of flow line trail interactions on the map, and not every one of them results in a breakthrough. So how do we know which ones are going to be problem areas? So across all 43 sites, there were hundreds of light and medium blue flow lines that cross skid trails, and there were dozens of dark to very dark blue flow lines that cross the trails. If we think about it on a per site basis, there were about 20 light to medium blue flow lines that crossed the skid trails, whereas there were only 2 to 3 dark to very dark blue flow lines. So kind of 20 of the medium-sized drainage area flow lines and 2 to 3 of the flow lines that really had large drainage areas and were also crossing streams. That's how frequent they were. So we wanted to find out how often these flow line trail crossings on the map result in sediment breakthroughs on the ground. In certain places in this presentation, I have called these breakthroughs that we saw on the map, I call them map breakthroughs. These are potential breakthroughs. So hopefully that terminology isn't too confusing, but essentially we counted the number of potential breakthroughs on the map per property and organized it by flow line category. And then we compared this number with the number of actual breakthroughs that we found on the ground. So for the very dark blue potential breakthroughs or map breakthroughs, we found that 69% of the time, these were actually breakthroughs on the ground. And the equivalent results for the other flow lines were 37%, 12%, and 8% for the dark blue, medium blue, and light blue potential breakthroughs, respectively. And to summarize this, the key finding from this study was that sediment breakthrough likelihood increases with the drainage area of those flow lines. So the larger the drainage area, the more likely we would be seeing a sediment breakthrough on the ground. And we did kind of a basic statistical analysis of these sediment breakthroughs and found that the median drainage area where we found a sediment breakthrough on the ground, the median drainage area was 1.3 hectares. So we've used this as kind of a cutoff because we can't practically prescribe BMPs for every place where there's a flow line trail crossing on the map. We're using this cutoff to focus on the flow lines that have a drainage area of 1.3 hectares and above. That way we can focus on trying to reduce runoff and erosion where we think the highest likelihood will be for a water quality problem. So to summarize what we found, on average, 5 sediment breakthroughs per kilometer of buffer surveyed on timber harvests in the New York City watershed. 30% of these sediment breakthroughs were from forest road stream crossings. And these are places where I think that these are relatively easy to have predicted, beforehand. 70% of the sediment breakthroughs we found were related to surface runoff interacting with skid trails away from stream crossings. So these are kind of the more difficult ones to predict. We did find that potential erosion rates were highest during and immediately after the harvest. And again, I think this means that BMPs need to be in place during and after the harvest as well to protect water quality. And while the flow lines with the larger drainage areas occurred less often on a per site basis, these were the ones that were more likely to cause sedimentation of streams. So what do these findings mean for our WAC Forestry BMP program? I think that it means that well-established BMPs like stream buffers, using water bars, using grass seed and straw mulch for surface cover, I think these will always be important for closing out timber harvests and using these during the harvest. But now our watershed foresters have this flow line information where they can focus on the flow lines that have drainage areas of 1.3 hectares or more to anticipate potential water quality problem areas. We now have a new BMP cost share component that addresses flow line trail crossings. And in our study, I think that roughly 35% of the sediment breakthroughs that we found could have been easily anticipated. And in this case, I'm talking about the major stream crossings and the places where the really dark blue flow lines cross skid trails. And for the remainder of all those flow lines, our foresters can focus on those that have a drainage area of 1.3 hectares and above, and they can use this flow line information coupled with boots on the ground scouting to be able to anticipate water quality problems and then prescribe BMPs to protect the water. And I think with that, I've come to the end of my presentation, and I can take any questions that you may have.
Дякуємо Крісу за презентацію.
Thank you, Chris, for your presentation.
Я хочу запросити вас до
And now I want to
запитань.
open it up for everyone.
У нас колись було таке
But before I do that, I would like to note that in the past, we had a project where I heard this phrase that there are no silly questions or there are no wrong questions. So if you have a question, but you think that it's a silly one or a wrong one, and that's why you don't want to ask it, please don't hesitate. So we would like to encourage you to ask any questions that you might have, because there are no right or wrong questions. There are no silly questions. If you want to clarify something, if something is not clear, then please ask your question. Well, I can start our Q&A session. Well, maybe I skipped it in the presentation, or maybe I misunderstood it, but I have the following question. Did you survey only those properties where BMPs were implemented, or you also surveyed properties that were harvested in the past 5 years, but BMPs were not implemented?
That's a great question. And all of the properties that we surveyed were harvested with BMPs. And these were BMPs that we cost shared through our cost share program.
Мгм. Тоді в мене наступне
Then I
запитання.
have a
Чи
follow-up question.
було у вас дослідження або чи плануєте ви
Did you have a
зробити
study, or maybe you intend to have a comparative study, like to compare those properties where BMPs were implemented and those properties where BMPs were not implemented?
That would be a great future study to look at breakthroughs with, that weren't part of our cost share program. And that's not to say that they didn't use BMPs, because, even if it's not a cost share program with us or project with us, loggers still would utilize some BMPs to protect the water. But yeah, that would be a good study to do. We have in the past, a student looked at not necessarily how well BMPs work to keep sediment out of streams, but she looked at how well loggers implemented BMPs that followed the New York State Forestry voluntary BMP field guide. So how well do those practices follow the book, basically? And she compared sites that we cost shared with our BMPs and sites that did not, that we weren't involved with. And she did show that the BMPs where we cost shared them, they were implemented at a better rate. So I guess, to summarize, they followed the book well with when we cost shared them, and versus when we weren't involved, the BMP implementation was not as good.
Це дуже цікаві висновки.
It's a very interesting finding.
А чи досліджувала ця студентка, наприклад, причини?
Did this student
Крім тієї причини, що
explore the root causes?
ще один партнер, який,
So
скажімо, контролював якість.
one reason is there was a partner that, I guess, implemented quality control with regard to BMPs, but were there any other reasons why loggers did not really implement BMPs on such a good level? Maybe they didn't have sufficient knowledge and expertise, or they tried to make some financial savings. So did she get deeper into the causes of why BMPs were not implemented in such a good manner if you were not cost sharing it?
That's also a great question. And as I recall, I don't think she did get deeper into exactly why the BMPs weren't implemented to the highest level, or they weren't now working as they once should. But I know in her discussion section, she talked about reasons why BMPs, as you look at them after the fact, may not be done to standard, or they're not working properly. And one reason could be that after BMPs are applied, landowners often want to use their trails, and they'll drive their trucks or their all-terrain vehicles, their four-wheelers, over top of water bars. And if they don't give enough time for the water bar to solidify, or they kind of traffic the site when the conditions are wet, they can compromise the effectiveness of the water bar after the logger has put them in. So that's one potential reason. In general, the BMPs, their effectiveness will start to reduce over time as just wear and tear on those water bars happens over time. But that's also happening at the same time that sites are becoming less erodible. Another thing that I can think of is that, we are doing studies of logger profitability currently, finding out how profitable it is for logging in the New York City watershed. And I guess to put it kind of concisely, it costs money for the loggers to apply these BMPs. And I think if a logger is stressed and, financially, they may be more apt to do maybe more of the bare minimum of BMP implementation and then move on to the next harvest site because it's the cutting of timber and that's where they make their money. So that could be a factor as well. Those are just some thoughts that I believe Emily Pei, who did the study, I think she touched on those in her discussion.
Дякую, Крісе, за відповіді.
Thank you, Chris, for your answers. And now I want to open it up to all the participants.
Українські колеги хочуть поділитися.
Maybe you have questions, or maybe you would like to share some of your own findings. So maybe we had similar studies in Ukraine, studies on sediment breakthroughs and causes thereof. So it would be stimulating and insightful to be exposed to any of such findings and conclusions. So maybe some similar studies were conducted in the past, or maybe there are some studies underway. Lesa and Volodymyr, I can see some raised hands. Lesa, you were first. I have a question on one of the slides that you, Chris, showed in your presentation. Thank you very much. A lot of work was invested, it's obvious. There's one photograph that you showed, and it was a screenshot from your smartphone. Do you have a special app? Because, I mean, you had some markings there. I mean, yeah, exactly, this slide and this screenshot.
Yes.
So basically, you tried to anticipate breakthroughs and everything. So is it like a special app or software? Is it like an app or software that can be downloaded? And is it available in Ukraine? Like if someone decides to apply something similar in Ukraine, is it available?
That's a great question. I am not sure if Avenza is available in Ukraine. It may be. I can only speak to its availability here in the US, but I know from in our experience, Avenza has a free version. And this is, yes, it's a smartphone mapping app. And there's a free version that allows you to save up to 3 PDF maps. And that just means that you can download the map, and even, if you're not in cell phone service, which about half the time we're in the forest, we don't have service. So it's very helpful to save that map offline, and we can know where we're at. We can navigate through the woods with the smartphone mapping app, and it has some basic tools that enables you to measure distances. You can measure areas. You can drop points of interest on that as well. And in the US, I think you can purchase a professional version of Avenza for roughly 100 to 120 US dollars.
Дякуємо. Леся закинула.
Thank you very much. Lesa posted a link to Avenza's website in the chat, and there's a free version of Avenza App Store. So basically, if you're interested, you can explore this issue on your own. Volodymyr, over to you. There's no sound. Please unmute yourself. We cannot hear you. I have a question about the first layout or diagram that you showed. Can you go back to the very beginning? The very, very beginning. With streams and with properties, like you had some properties and then you marked some trails there. Just a second, but we'll try to find that slide. This one? Exactly. The map on the left. What is the scale of this map?
I apologize, that is in feet, but there's a scale bar at the.
На 0,3 помножити.
Well, we need to multiply by 0.3.
В одному сантиметрі скільки було? 180 футів, так?
1 centimeter is 180 feet, right? Well, they're not sure. So 180 feet multiplied by 0.3, 54. So 1 centimeter contains 90 feet.
Can you say, Chris, how many feet in 1 centimeter?
Так сантиметрів нема. Please tell how,
Whatever you know.
Meter.
whatever, yes. And then we will transfer.
Ні, хай буде в футах, але в одному сантиметрі скільки футів?
So how many feet in 1 centimeter? Well, you don't really know anything about centimeters, right?
I know there are 2.5 inches in a. Wait, 2
Can you-
point. Maybe I'm mixing up my
Tell how
conversions.
many- Because we cannot understand how many feet in inch. From this picture, we cannot.
Yeah,
We don't
It-
see the picture in the real size. That's why
right. Yeah. Yeah, that's different. I'm sorry for that.
Це дуже суттєво, Володимир Леонідович.
Volodymyr, is it essential?
Розумієте, це там кількість тих волоків,
Well, it's the number of skidways and the number of streams. Like if there's a stream in 3 meters or in 30 meters, I mean, that's important information. 30 meters, I think, 30 to 40 meters.
гідрологічна мережа.
I mean, you have this really
can see how
dense.
often these light blue flow lines occur. That will. What is the distance between this light blue flow line?
I think I see what you're meaning there.
Будьте здорові.
Well, it looks like in places, roughly 30 meters, maybe distance. In others, could be more like 50. But also in this, I don't know if you can see my.
Зрозуміло. І це постійні чи й тимчасові водотоки?
Are these permanent or like temporary lines, flow lines?
So these aren't real. They're just representations of where flow could be on the ground. So they need to be verified in the field. So, but I think I know what you mean. Some of these are like the darker blue flow
Коли йде
line.
дощ, тоді вода ними тече чи не тече. От питання всього.
Is there water flowing in there? So do you have these streams? Are these streams like permanent ones, or you have these flow paths only during precipitation, for example, or rainfall?
more so flow paths during rainfall. Some of them do
Зрозумів.
have like a
Який схил місцевості?
well-defined scoured channel, and then others are more, we call them ephemeral or short-lived, for only during heavy rainfall events do they flow with water. Those are the ones that have the smaller drainage areas. The larger drainage areas are the ones where you can see, you know, bedrock and scoured areas where there was once flow.
Який схил тої місцевості, яка
What is the slope of this terrain? I mean, the terrain that we can see on this map. Roughly, what is the slope there? 10,
Roughly,
15, 12?
probably more steep than that. I would say, from memory on this trail and looking at the topo lines, maybe something like 20% slopes.
20%. Менше
20%. So it's like 10 degrees. And also I have a question about this universal soil loss equation. Why don't you account for the slope of the terrain? Because it's one of the main factors that conditions or determines erosion.
I apologize if I didn't specify that we measured the slope of the, we didn't measure the slope of the terrain when we estimated erosion. We measured the slope of the road surface, because that we weren't estimating erosion on the slope. We were estimating it on the skid trail. So we measured the slope and the length of the trail, as well as surface cover and things like that. So I guess to explain, we didn't.
This is clear. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Volodymyr, thank you very much for your questions. Chris, thank you very much for your answers. There are also two questions in the chat. There's a question from Yuri. Did you use the findings of this study on sediment breakthroughs to evaluate their impact on water quality and some other indicators like vegetation preservation, aquatic biota, and aquatic flow paths?
Oh, thank you for that question. And that is a limitation of this study, in that we really were only looking to document whether or not we saw evidence of runoff and sediment that reached the stream. We did not measure any water quality parameters. We did not sample any stream insects or benthic macroinvertebrates. What we did to say how severe the sediment breakthrough was really to measure the width of the flow path as it reached the stream, and that width was an indicator of stream, kind of the power of the breakthrough. But no, we did not estimate impacts on the stream water quality, more so just whether or not a breakthrough occurred.
Дякую за відповідь. Наступне запитання.
Thank you for the answer. There's another question from Mr. Yuri Hromak. Did you compare the frequency of breakthroughs on clear-cut properties? Because if we have selective cuts, then you have vegetation that also deters or hampers the flow, not only skidways. So did you compare some properties with clear cutting and properties with selective cuts?
That's a great question too. And no, we only had timber harvests that were representative of selective harvests. Clear cutting in our area is relatively rare, aside from there are some clear cuts on state lands and smaller patch clear cuts, but all of our sites were representative of selective logging. However, comparing our results with those in Virginia and in New Zealand, I know that those harvests in Virginia and New Zealand, those were clear-cut harvests. And we did find similar breakthrough frequencies, even though they were, wildly different terrain, and that was clear-cut harvesting versus our selective logging. So I don't know what that means, other than maybe it's not the impact of harvesting itself, like the general harvest area, but we do know that we're generally more concerned about our skid trails, our forest roads, our landing areas being sources of sedimentation, and not necessarily like the cutover area as being a concern.
Дякую. Так,
There's a thank you from Yuri. It's a comment from him. There must be a lot of other factors that have an impact on the emergence of sediment breakthroughs. Of course, you cannot really interpret that in any conclusive manner. Any other questions to Chris? I don't see any other questions in the chat. Well, I have one question. It's a weird one, and it popped up in my mind in the course of your presentation, so I will articulate it. Did you have situations when the surveyed properties had breakthroughs that were the result of activities in the adjacent properties? So not the consequence of what loggers did in that property, but maybe there were some breakthroughs that occurred as a result of any activity in the adjacent property.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's very good. Yes, we had, I'm thinking of one site in particular that had a timber harvest several years prior, and after that timber harvest, there was a huge isolated thunderstorm that dumped a lot of rainfall very quickly on the site, and we saw a lot of impacts from that heavy downpour of rain. I don't know if necessarily it came from off the property. We just saw scoured flow paths everywhere on the hill slope, and that was an example of where it was difficult to say that how much of the impact was from the timber harvest. Our feeling was that the roads and trails from the harvest had some impact for sure, but this was also a natural event that happened, and it was more so just the sheer volume of rainfall and runoff. But typically, I would say no, that
Тобто це надзвичайне.
So basically, it's more of a natural calamity and the impact of this natural calamity, right?
In that
But-
case, yes.
Було би цікаво
But
подивитися.
then it would be interesting to see what happened in the neighboring or adjacent properties.
На цій ділянці, де ви
So like
бачите,
you have
великий дорога,
this specific property where you surveyed skid trails and roads, and then you have maybe like an adjacent property, whether the consequences are more dire in terms of sediment breakthroughs because of skid trails in comparison with the adjacent property that didn't really have these trails, for example.
Right.
Будь ласка, колеги,
Можна запитання?
Colleagues, any other questions? I have a question.
Кріс говорив, що лісозаготівельник
Chris, you mentioned that loggers have to implement BMPs or like bare minimum. What is this bare minimum and who has control over this bare minimum, or who is responsible for compliance with this bare minimum?
Thanks for your question. So in New York State, we have a voluntary BMP program. So loggers don't necessarily have to implement BMPs to any certain standard, but you can be shut down from logging if you're found to negatively impact water quality. So if someone sees a stream running brown with sediment, they could notify the State Department of Environmental Conservation, and you can be shut down from that. But when I think about bare minimum BMPs, I think at the basic rate, a logger needs to put in water bars to at least keep the trail functional during rainy conditions, because a logger doesn't want to get their machines bogged down in mud. And so I would say that could be an example of a bare minimum of just like, so that the logger can operate during less than ideal conditions. And then maybe the best case scenario is that they actually are thinking along the lines of these flow lines, and they're putting in BMPs anticipating that these flow lines could become actual channels of runoff during the harvest, and they're putting in water bars to account for that.
Дякую за відповідь.
Дякую,
Thank
Кріс.
you very much for the answer. Chris, I would like to add something. Eduard, as an addition to this answer, I will send you the recording of the previous webinar, because we placed significant emphasis on this issue, why loggers implement BMPs, what the advantages are, why loggers might not want to do that, or conversely, they want to do that. Chris's colleague gave the second webinar. So I will definitely provide you with the recording of this webinar, and you will be able to glean more information there. By the way, if you have signed up for our webinars, at the end of the entire series, I will definitely disseminate the entire package of training materials to all of you. The webinar recordings, all the PowerPoint presentations, so you will definitely receive the entire package, and you, Eduard, will receive the recording of webinar 2 from me, because it was very instructive and insightful. Another question or remark? So you compared your study with the studies in Virginia and New Zealand.
That's correct. Kind of in coming up with a study design, we did a literature review of previous research, and I was actually the researcher from New Zealand. I did the sediment breakthroughs work in New Zealand, and some of former colleagues of mine did the work in New Zealand, or sorry, in Virginia. And yeah, we compared our results with those two studies, as well as the Georgia study. It was harder to compare because they looked at breakthrough frequency as breakthroughs per acre, or sorry, per hectare of harvest, whereas we were comparing our breakthroughs to the length of trail that we evaluated.
Дякую.
Thank you for that. Thank you. There's another question in the chat from Mr. Yuri Derbal. Can we state that in the US, there's no practice of penalties and sanctions for the excessive erosion rate? I will explain what I mean.
Ага. Це на увазі, що не загальна ерозія на сільгоспугіддях, а на
I'm not
саме...
really talking about erosion in agricultural lands, but erosion as a result of logging or harvesting. So are there any penalties or sanctions that are imposed on loggers?
That is a good question, and I'm not sure how it would be enforced, because I don't think any agencies are estimating potential erosion for a harvest site and they see that, oh, this is more than 20 tons per hectare per year, you will receive a citation. I think it's more of an effects, like what is the impact? Like they may see a stream that's running brown with sedimentation, or they may grab a water sample to measure suspended sediment, but I don't think you can be cited for the actual erosion rate. You may receive a citation just from the visual, you know, if it looks like it's very poor practice, that runoff can flow unchecked over, you know, 100% bare soil, that I could see being cited for.
Дякую за відповідь.
Thank you for the answer. I think that I saw a raised hand from Mr. Yuri Hremyak. I have the following question to you, Chris. At the beginning of your presentation, you referred to the amount invested in the implementation of BMPs. Who receives the money? So what is the approach to earmarking those funds? Do you have some sort of risk assessment? Like, for example, the risk of sediment breakthroughs? Because, I mean, you cannot just secure and earmark funds to anyone, right? There should be some sort of ground for it. So what is the methodology underpinning it? Thank you.
Thank you for that. So the funds are typically received directly by the loggers that implement the forestry BMPs. And sometimes the money goes to a forester that has laid out. We have a cost share project for locating forest roads and trails, marking where they should go. And the way that we fund these projects is that a logger will send an application to our program, and one of our watershed foresters will visit the property, and they will walk the site to estimate the length of trail that will be needed, the number of water bars that could be used, as well as other practices like gravel on the landing. And they come up with an estimate of what, if the logger implemented each one of these practices, that would, what would be the cost to do that. And that's how we come up with an approved amount for that project. And then whenever the harvest is completed, our watershed foresters go out and they walk the site again to see what the logger implemented, and we only pay them for what the BMPs that they have implemented on the ground. So if there were fewer water bars than what was originally approved, then, you know, we only pay for what they actually put on the site. I hope that is helpful with how we fund those projects.
Так, дякую. Паралельно ще питання.
Thank you, but I have another question. It's a sort of follow-up question. So any logger can apply this, can apply for it, right? So any logger that has a property and wants to do harvesting.
That's generally correct. Like any logger that is cutting a doing a timber harvest within the boundaries of the New York City watershed, they can apply for our cost share funding. And we do have a higher rates. So we have some incentives for loggers that have gone through a training process called Trained Logger Certified, which is chainsaw safety. They have to take a core class in forest ecology and silviculture, as well as a health and safety, a first aid course. And that's a continuing education program for our loggers that work here. And to incentivize them to do that, we have higher cost share rates for loggers that maintain that certification.
Дякую. І останнє
Thank you very
запитання.
much. And the last question on my part. Are there similar practices in other states or in other locations in the US?
Yeah, there are other BMP cost share programs in the United States. I feel like, not to say that our example is completely unique, but I feel like it is a unique example. But I do know that there are other states that have some sort of reimbursement to loggers for using BMPs on timber harvests. But we are a unique case in that the funding from the water rates that New York City residents pay, that provides funding to the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. And I feel like, yeah, we can safely say it is a unique case in that I feel like the funding is there to be able to do a project like this. Some other states may not have, other states or locations may not have the funding to back this type of program.
Дякую. Дякую.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yuri, for your question. Thank you, Chris, for your answers. And there's another question from Yuri Derbel. I think while crafting a harvesting plan, it's possible to anticipate potential sediment breakthroughs and ask for funds by loggers to prevent them. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of this, the benefit of these flow lines is as a pre-harvest planning tool that helps to come up with a harvest plan, to come up with BMPs that are there to protect water quality where the flow lines cross trails on the map.
Якщо можна, я Юрію Юрійовичу дам інформацію стосовно
I
України.
would like to provide some information for Yuri about Ukraine. We analyzed 3,000 or 3,500 actual harvesting plans in the Carpathians. We call them technical cards for whatever reason. But unfortunately, we don't really have accurate information on the location of the properties. And that was our proposal, that basically we need to specify requirements for these technical cards or harvesting plans. But it's just an ongoing effort. Thank you for that clarification, Volodymyr. Well, that was more about the scale, and that's why you asked about the scale. Because, I mean, considering the scale of our technical maps or our harvesting plans, we will not be able to mark all the flow lines and things like that. So basically, we need to modify requirements for our technical maps or these harvesting plans. That was just a little bit of the Ukrainian context. Natalia, if there are no other questions, well, I don't really see anything else in the chat. I would like to offer some information on the current state of play in Ukraine. But before I do that, I would like to express my profuse gratitude to Chris for extremely instructive and insightful presentation. This is new information. Unfortunately, we are not employing this methodology in Ukraine. We carried out a study to determine soil disturbance or some erosion processes, or like, for example, disturbance of undergrowth, but only within the boundaries of harvesting properties, not within the boundaries of a watershed. So we have never identified the number of sediment breakthroughs. This is something new for Ukrainian foresters and researchers. So this is new information that we still need to process and account for in the future. I also have a question about the mathematical expression of this universal equation. So in general, you referred to this universal equation that you utilize to determine the amount of sedimentation, but what about the mathematical expression? So these are theoretical values, right?
That's correct. It's a theoretical potential erosion rate. And I do know that the model was developed with, I think back in the 1970s, the United States Department of Agriculture, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, they had test plots throughout the US that were, I guess, I remember in feet what they were, about 70 feet long, but they measured erosion. They did rainfall simulations and measured runoff and sediment coming off of these test plots with different slopes and surface cover practices. So it's an empirical model that was developed from that field research. And I know that the model incorporates rainfall. So the user just has a handbook in the field with them, and some of the values you can obtain before you go to the field, and it's rainfall. You can get, and that's there's a unit for, I guess, how energy intense, like how much energy does the rainfall have for that area. And there is the slope of the ground, which we talked about before, various conservation practices, and I'm trying to remember the other ones, but I just remember when we gathered information about the soil type and its erodibility. So the user has to select values that most closely resemble what they're finding for the rainfall, the slope, and the soil type and its erodibility. And then you multiply all those factors together, and the result is in, for us, it's tons per acre per year. Metric is tons per hectare per year. And it's representative of the long term, so like a 30-year average erosion rate. So in that sense, it's been adapted for forestry practices. I think it was originally used for agriculture, but we're using it specifically on forest roads and trails, places where there's, we have the most disturbed soil.
Дякую. Ну і ми робили 5-річні дослідження стосовно
We also conducted 5-year studies to determine the impact of harvesting on the purity of water. This is something that we did in 2 watersheds, 1,500 hectares each, roughly. And we determined a tight correlation between the purity of water, depending on the working hours, like, for example, starting from 8 o'clock in the morning and until 4 p.m., let's say. So whether the water quality or water purity dropped or not. And we also collected data depending on the weekday. Like, for example, on Monday, water was cleaner. And then obviously by the midweek, water purity and water quality deteriorated. But those were relative attributes or indicators for water quality. This is something that is aligned with the Ukrainian methodology. Thank you. Thank you, Volodymyr, for your comments. I know that among our participants, we have multiple representatives of universities and higher educational institutions. We also have some researchers attending. Maybe you have some questions. I believe that it's a great opportunity for you to converse with your colleagues. And I would like to remind you that if you have some questions later after the webinar, you can forward them to us, or you can contact our experts and researchers directly. There's another comment from Yuri Derbal in the chat. I'm not sure whether it's a question or a comment. I saw in the presentation that for simulation and modeling, you used most of those characteristics that are included in the watershed condition evaluation recommendations, like forest cover, canopy cover, tree species, etc. So it's not a question, it's just a comment. So basically, it's just a continuation to what Volodymyr said. Chris, you can either agree or disagree, concur, or I don't know, deny.
Oh, I'm sorry, my internet connection says it's unstable. Could you repeat that question, please? I'm sorry.
Зі слайдів презентації
It's a comment from Yuri Derbal. I saw in the presentation that for modeling or simulation, you used most of the characteristics that are included in the watershed condition evaluation guidelines: forest cover, canopy cover, tree species, etc. So it's just a comment from Mr. Yuri Derbal, and you can either concur with this comment or maybe object or deny.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that sounds right. Yes, we measured pretty much everything we could think of about the forest buffer condition, just to demonstrate how good of a sediment trap it should be.
Дякую, гарно. Кріс, ми бачимо якийсь робочий стіл.
Chris, we can see your desktop or something. I guess you're looking for something for the quiz, maybe.
Oh, I was looking for that. We could do the quiz if you want. I was looking for that
Якщо в нас
forest
немає
buffer
запитань,
condition.
давайте пошукайте спочатку показники, а
Well,
потім...
maybe find that slide first, and that will give more time for our participants to come up with questions. But I mean, a quiz, this is something that our participants can do on their own.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if I found the right one, but this is kind of that buffer where that slide where I talk about what we measured, I think.
На екрані ви бачите там в розділі коментарів можна подивитися.
Yeah, if you pay attention to the slide notes, you will see all the characteristics, all the factors or indicators that were measured. And we will also disseminate the PowerPoint presentation. But basically, if it's fine with you, Chris, I will not send it as a PDF format. I will send it as a PPT. So basically people will be able to access notes as well.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Маленький коментар, Леся, дозволите?
I have a brief comment, if I may.
Да, будь ласка.
Yes, sure.
Наталія, я перепрошую, я переплутав Наталію.
Well, I said Lesa, but Natalia is moderating. Eduard, it's okay. In Europe, in the Danube watershed, there's a similar model, but it's used for agriculture to evaluate diffuse pollution. Unfortunately, I'm not really familiar with this model being used for forestry. In the State Emergency Service of Ukraine, we have some experts who specialize in diffuse pollution, and they employed this model, but unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge, they haven't really used it for forestry yet. So it would be very useful in the future to adapt this model. So why not use it for forestry as well? But this is just a future perspective or prospect, because it would be a great opportunity to involve researchers and foresters. Could you specify the institute? Can you refer to a specific institute? Natalia Osacha. She's the head of the research institute within the State Emergency Service of Ukraine. This institute explores diffuse pollution, so I'm ready to provide you with any context that I have. I extended your invitation to them, but I guess they have poor connectivity, or maybe they're too busy in Kyiv, and that's why they were not able to join. But I will definitely provide you with their contacts, because I'm positive that they would definitely be interested in exploring this topic in the future. So maybe we can pick one site or a property in the Carpathians, in Ivano-Frankivsk region or Transcarpathian region, and we can analyze one of the watersheds. To the best of my knowledge, they are putting together a management plan for the Dniester watershed and the Western Bug River basin. So this topic is definitely pertinent to both practitioners and researchers. Eduard, thank you very much for this comment. We will be grateful for any context that you might have. We will forward all the materials to Natalia Osacha that you alluded to. And if you talk to her in the near future, just mention our webinar and refer to our training materials. Thank you very much for that. Any other questions?
Ми насправді можемо і раніше завершити,
Well,
якщо
actually, we can call it a day a little bit earlier.
Наталка, так давай, може, для підсумку ще раз на ті запитання поглянемо.
Well, maybe we can have a look at the quiz question. That will be a good summary of our webinar. Well, I just think that people will not answer themselves, so we will basically make Chris repeat the same invitation, but whatever. Let's give it a try.
we can move to the quiz questions. But you should be ready that you will provide the answers to the question.
Natalia, should I pull up the questions now or?
Так, можна,
Yes.
можемо перейти.
Yes. I mean, we still have a little bit of time left, so
You have it in the presentation, actually.
Chris, you have the quiz in the presentation.
You had it at the end.
Oh, that's right.
At the end of your presentation.
I remember I
And also a
edited my
small comment
questions to
about
be a
the
little bit
weather.
more clear, but. Oh, how's that?
Так, видно? Отож, в нас,
Yes, we can see everything.
який підготував Кріс для вас,
So here you can see
а ми вас запрошуємо
the quiz put together by Chris, and if you would like
інформацію.
to answer,
Ми, такий, зробили такий
give us a signal.
вправу з повторення.
So basically, it would be a good repetition exercise. Previous studies of forestry BMPs in the New York City watershed assessed the extent to which loggers followed the New York State BMP field guide. How did the study evaluate forestry BMP effectiveness? So this is a question.
And then am I supposed to, oh wait, someone from the crowd.
We wait if someone wants to answer.
Okay.
Якщо хтось хоче сказати
If
свою
you
думку.
want to try and answer this question, if you want to express your opinion, please go ahead. If not, then Chris will do it. Volodymyr, thank you very much for your willingness to support us. It would be a shame to acknowledge that we didn't understand Chris's presentation. The number of breakthroughs per 5 kilometers and also the amount of sedimentation in the streams. Tons or kilos, like 10, 15 kilos or something like that. So but basically two main indicators. These are the two main indicators that can testify to the effectiveness or lack thereof of BMPs. Well, I am in a more advantageous situation because you remember the conclusions. Old, reliable BMPs are important and they should be employed. I remember that as well.
We can move to the next question. Дякуємо. Дякуємо, Володимир Леонідович.
We can move to the next question. So thank you, Volodymyr.
Наступне запитання.
The next question is as follows. What is a sediment breakthrough as it relates to timber harvesting?
Питання, яке стосується визначень.
It's a definition-related question, basically.
Ви незмінно тримаєте руку.
Volodymyr, you still have your hand raised. Does it mean that you want to answer this question as well? Or you forgot to remove it?
Ага, то ви забрали підняту руку, не хочете відповідати.
So you removed the raised hand, which means you do not want to answer this specific question, right? We cannot hear you, Volodymyr.
Ну, чесно кажучи, виходить, що
Well, to be frank, it will be like a one actor performance. So I'm not really sure that it's good. Sediment breakthrough. Well, basically, that was a new indicator for me, a new term. So on the one hand, it's simple and straightforward. I mean, you don't really need any specific devices or experiments to identify sediment breakthroughs. You can see them visually. But if we have runoff concentrated in the trails and then the runoff reaches the stream, this is something that we can easily see. And it's also a testament to the effectiveness of BMPs. So this is something practical, and this is something that we can easily use as part of our practice. Well, thank you, Volodymyr. You, as always, you provide comprehensive answers. I think we can continue to the next one. The next question is as follows. The main finding from this study was that sediment breakthrough likelihood increased with what? I know the answer because I perused this presentation, but I am in an advantageous situation there. Is there anyone else who would like to try and answer this question? Anyone apart from Volodymyr? Do not be shy. We want to see your faces. We want to hear your voices.
Нема бажаючих. Добре, я тоді завершу.
Well, I think I will answer it. The main finding from the study was that sediment breakthrough likelihood increased with flow line drainage area. This is what I remember.
Можливо, дренажна площа, може площа водозбору правильніше називати.
Well, maybe it's better to call it watershed area because drainage is like water drainage. Well, but this is the way it was, formulated in the presentation. Well, Volodymyr, if you disagree with the Ukrainian equivalents, we will be grateful for any proposals. But for the time being, I will just continue using the same terminology that was employed during the webinar, during the presentation. The next question: how did the Watershed Agricultural Council Forestry Program use this main finding? Well, it's a broad question and it entails a lengthy answer, basically. This was exactly Eduard's question, and there were several questions from Yuri Hrymak in this regard. How funds are allocated, who receives funding for BMPs and who doesn't. So there are a lot of aspects that come into play here, but maybe there are people who would like to answer this question.
Maybe Chris, it would be better if you once more answer this particular question.
Chris, did you hear Natalia? She wants you to answer this question.
Oh, perfect. Yes. So we use the study finding in general. Our foresters can now use these flow lines as a pre-harvest planning tool, as we talked about. So that helps them to anticipate potential water quality problems. And also, we developed a new cost share BMP that is related to these flow line trail intersections. Previously, we just cost shared stream crossings where our trails cross the major streams. Now we have a cost share that we pay loggers to implement things like water bars, surface cover practices as well, like putting down logs or grass seed and straw mulch when they close out the trail. But we have cost share practices that are now special to these flow line trail intersections.
Супер. Дякуємо.
Fantastic, thank you. The next one: name any number of ways to control surface runoff and sedimentation associated with forest roads and trails.
Напевно, да, будь-які способи. Так, дякую, Олю. Тут у нас точно Юрій Юрійович буде знати відповідь.
Yuri should know the answer. I'm pretty much positive about it. I think that most of the participants attending this webinar participated in the previous webinars as well. And the first webinar was dedicated to harvesting practices and how to control surface runoff. So I would like to remind all of us of some of the barriers that we can use, like, for example, straw barriers. Fabric can also be used to control and deter surface runoff. And Volodymyr also promotes some ways to control surface runoff. I mean, a lot of these ways were mentioned during the first webinar, but I can see that the participants are a little bit shy. I mean, you were exposed to all this information. If you participated in the first webinar, you definitely were exposed to all this information. You are right. And we have the translation of these best management practices for New Hampshire. And most of these ways are detailed there, including technical aspects. Well, I'm like a priest in the church, you know, like priests have services 3 times a day, and they remind people of 10 commandments. So this is my role sort of. Volodymyr, you raised your hand.
Я просто хочу сказати, буквально до мене вже дзвонили з Києва.
I've received a call from Kyiv.
Я вже казав, нові вимоги
As I've referenced earlier,
до лісових доріг.
we are crafting new requirements for forest roads.
Вимог до екологічних аспектів при
And
будівництві і проєктуванні.
there's this aspect of requirements, environmental requirements for forest roads. And this is exactly the new thing that we added, ways to prevent erosion and ways to control surface runoff and sedimentation into streams. So this is something that is already incorporated into our new requirements. Fantastic. Thank you, Volodymyr. We have one more question. While they were not useful in predicting sediment breakthroughs in this study, riparian buffers protect water quality in a multitude of ways. Name some of them. Volodymyr, you still have your hand raised, or maybe you're dying to answer this question. We cannot hear you. You are muted. I was still perusing the question, so I forgot to remove my raised hand. It's all right. No big thing.
I think, Chris, the floor is yours again to answer this question.
Chris, they want you to answer this question.
Oh, what was it? I forgot. Name. Oh, what do riparian buffers or streamside management zones do for water quality? They provide shade to cool the stream water. They provide sources of wildlife habitat. So leaves, sticks, debris provide places for fish and macroinvertebrates to live and feed on. They can filter sediment, although as we saw in this study, we can't expect them to filter all the sediment that runs off. And they also do a lot to help strengthen stream banks to prevent stream bank erosion. Those are some of the key factors that come to my mind.
Дякую, гарно.
Thank you very much. Well, I guess we can transition to the last question of this quiz.
Таке ще було питання. Чи впливає на результати погода?
Did the weather impact our results?
I guess that's one that I can only answer because I did not cover that. And it surprisingly, it did not really impact our results. We thought maybe we would do field surveys on rainy days and just find breakthroughs everywhere. And that wasn't the case, which was good to see. I think typically we found between 5 and 6 sediment breakthroughs per site visit, and we didn't find more on rainy days versus kind of nice and sunny weather days. But when it was raining, we did get some really nice action shots like this. It was helpful to visualize these runoff flow paths that became apparent when it was rainy.
Дякую, Крісу. І з цим ми б наблизились до
Thank you,
п'ятої.
Chris. Well, it's already 5 p.m. A big thank you to all the participants of our webinar. Thank you for your active participation and engagement. If you want to make some concluding remarks, if you want to say goodbye, or if you want to say see you later, please turn on your cameras.
Може забрати stop sharing screen?
Chris, could you stop sharing?
Can you stop? Then we will have a gallery, better gallery view. Так. Дякуємо вам. Гарно. Приєднуйтеся до наступного нашого
Immense
вебінару.
gratitude to all of you. Join our next webinar next week. The focus will be on the construction and design of low intensity forest roads. The key lecturer will be Ms. Erika Borum. She visited Ukraine several years ago, so she's well familiar and cognizant of the context in Ukraine. Another thank you to Chris for this insightful presentation. Thank you, all of you, for your active participation, and a big thank you to our interpreter for interpretation. And we hope to see all of you
На протязі перших 3 слів, які у нас там.
in Ukraine. And for whatever reason, Volodymyr is saying that my first 3 words were a testament to high quality interpretation. Volodymyr knows me because we participated in one offline event a long time ago, and I was an interpreter there.
Всього найкращого.
Дякуємо.
Дякую.
Всього доброго.
Дякуємо.
Так,
Тримайтеся.
до вечора.
Дякую.
Okay, enjoy the rest of the day. Have a good night or a good day, depending on where you are.
Відео платіжки провайдерно. Якщо
Please, shall we stay for some few more minutes just to sum up?
That'd be great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
If you have some time, Chilette mentioned that she has to run in 5 minutes. Ой, Олі, дякуємо. Дякуємо, це так прекрасно. Дякуємо.